I'm Irena Senakoje. Welcome to this Fane Online event with author Karen Lord on behalf of Fane Productions and Dark Matter. Karen joins us to talk about her new book, The Blue Beautiful World, as well as her career as an author so far. I'd like to introduce her without further ado. Barbadian writer Dr. Karen Lord is the author of Redemption in Indigo, which won the William L. Crawford Award and the Mythopoeic Fantasy Award for Adult Literature and was nominated for the World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. Her other works include the science fiction novels The Best of All Possible Worlds and The Galaxy Game, and the crime fantasy novel Unraveling. Lord edited the anthology New Worlds, Old Ways, Speculative Tales from the Caribbean. Her novel, The Blue Beautiful World, has been longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Karen, welcome. Congratulations on The Blue Beautiful
Thank
World.
you.
It's a stunning sci-fi offering about how we can radically reimagine the world, ecological responsibility, and the potential for human beings to transcend human limitations to create a better world. I mean, it's a hugely ambitious novel of such scope and vision. Can you talk about your intentions and ideas behind this incredible work?
You're scaring me. I'm glad that you like it. I'm glad that you
Oh, it's
see a
amazing.
lot of, scope and so forth in it. When you ask me, what are my intentions and my ambitions and so on, a lot of it comes from my background in terms of both my study and my work. Because I really do not just come from a love of science fiction. And my first studies were in like physics and astronomy and history of science and technology. But also, I'm very much attached to what's happening with this world, what our chances are in terms of not only things like how we treat our biosphere and what climate change means for the survival of humanity, but also what it means to evolve as a collective, what it means for us to learn to govern ourselves properly. My part of my background does include studies and working in diplomacy. And sometimes when you widen your scope from how your country is functioning to how other people's countries are functioning, you begin to see certain, shall we say, human traits, collective human traits that you begin to ask yourself, how do we deal with these? It's almost as if we can't escape them. So we need to find strategies, structures that mitigate for the way we behave as a collective, but as a species. But ultimately, we're trying not to destroy ourselves, aren't we? We're trying to live our best lives, make sure everyone can live their best lives. And I'm constantly thinking of how to solve those problems in a fictional way. And just playing with it because obviously it's a very small thought experiment for a very large environment. um I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it does beautifully. I love that you frame it in the sense of thinking about the collective, which more people should do, I feel. You're such a generous writer and thinker that I feel you're always centering community and how we can kind of evolve together.
Mhm.
And that's so wonderful for an artist because there is the tendency, not just for artists, but for human beings to be I. Whereas I find very much with you that you're so rooted in that community activism, if you will, as part of the
Mhm.
framework of what you do. The novel is also about change makers, it's about dreamers. It's about mobilizing young voices, which I think is fantastic because, the young are our future. And we follow the trajectories of these characters. Peter Hendrix, who's a VR tech inventor, big-hearted celebrity Charyssa, and also Kanoa, a member of the Global Council of Young People, brought in to kind of reconfigure this relationship between humankind and alien societies. Each fascinating, but brought together, just again makes for such a powerful read. Why these particular characters, and why this particular setting? Because I feel you're so intentional in everything that you do.
um some of my intentions are because I'm looking to highlight or frame or illustrate something very specific in the novel. But to be perfectly honest, some of my choices are to cover up a lack of knowledge that I might have. Like I might say, oh, it might be exciting if it were set here, but I don't know enough about this place, so it's not going to get set here. So I do want to make it clear that you know, not all of the intentions come from a place of having absolute knowledge and power, and it's our very best book that could be created, kind of thing. In terms of the three people I've chosen, so okay, Peter Hendrix is actually one of my favorite characters. And just by pure chance, he's the only, well, I call him an Antillian character, basically a character from the Caribbean, originally from the Caribbean. Now based in the Netherlands, has gone through a whole bunch of interesting things in his life. I get to portray him as an elder who is looking back on a large scope of history, you know, both sort of country's history and also personal history, and has very passionate ideas about what it means to be free, what it means to have control over yourself, your image, your words, everything like that. So that's kind of why Peter Hendrix is the way he is and where he came from. Charyssa is interesting to me because it's actually a fact that you can have a beauty queen who wants world peace. Because there are women who start off with these beauty contests, which sometimes we kind of sneer at, but they get this visibility, they you know, train in this poise and this communication, and quite a few of them go into politics afterwards, or go into some kind of, you know, like UN ambassador type thing and so forth, and do try to use their influence to make a change. I made Charyssa a child of two continents, again, just to sort of make it clear that, you know, some of us are not just attached to one place or to one people. Some of us have multitudes in our blood and multitudes in our hopes, in terms of what the future should be like and who should benefit. So that was Charyssa. Kanoa is basically a representative of the nations of the Pacific. And there are several reasons for that. Okay, so I'm a Guyana Island girl myself, so somebody had to represent the island people and the connection to the ocean. But they are also the ones so affected by several things. First of all, of course, climate change, sea level rise is affecting quite a few island nations in the Pacific. And we also have the reality of, when you look at the history of the Pacific, a lot of those islands and island nations have suffered from being in strategically important places for larger countries to fight over access to them in order to have, you know, military bases or trade bases and so forth. So there's always this element of, you know, you kind of want to live peaceably by yourself, but the outside world is never going to let you. So you don't have a chance to just be like, almost like small town mentality. You always have to be looking outwards. You always have to be thinking about, how do I protect my community and my culture from these constant outside influences? So that's the reason for the choices that I made in those characters, to be able to tell a particular type of story from their point of view.
Yeah, and they absolutely contain multitudes. I mean, you render them so wonderfully and so evocatively. I think this novel is really clever because it's so future facing. It feels particularly timely, but also that if I pick this book up in 25 years, that it will be relevant. And if it was picked up
let me
10 years
savor
past
that. Stop. I gotta savor that. I like the idea of writing for future generations. You just said the thing that makes me the happiest. I like the idea. I mean, it's nice to pay your bills now. It's nice to, you know, get the sales now. But I like the idea that my book is not going to go to print in a hurry, that there are generations to come that will be able to read it and say, you know, this is significant in some way. I'm sure that my guesses are going to look very interesting and even amusing to future generations. But I hope there's still like a core thread that, even if it's just, oh, isn't it interesting how that particular generation, that point in history was thinking about our future? I hope even that is going to be relevant to future readers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I consider it a blueprint for change. That's what you've created. And that's so potent. If you think about the
Mhm.
times that we're in, and human beings trying to grapple for solutions to be better people, to care about the earth more, to care about each other more.
Mhm.
And this book has so much of that at its core. I want you to talk a little bit about the ideas behind that, whether that was intentional or not, and also what references you looked at to help inspire it, both books and otherwise. I've heard you talk about references like Camus Braithwaite and his poem Dust, also Nalo Hopkinson, who we both have a real appreciation for. Obviously, you've been compared to Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a huge compliment, but I think a seller would be raising her hands up to you personally. And
There.
the wonderful, wonderful Earl Lovelace, also amazing. So a real range there. But could you
Mhm.
talk about things that you drew from, wells that you drew from, influences that kind of helped you in a way, I guess, gave you permission to do this? Because, like we said earlier, it's such an ambitious work. It's one thing to have the thought, it's another to execute it and have the courage to render that ambition and make it real. So I'm intrigued by this. Yeah, so could you talk about that?
Okay, well, first of all, don't call it courage. When I'm in the bubble of my thought experiment, I'm not being scared. I'm just being curious. So I can't claim courage for that. In terms of the people who influenced me, works that influenced me, I have to say that quite a few of names that you mentioned, the colleagues that you mentioned, are people who influenced me not so much by what they wrote, but by how they wrote.
Mm.
You mentioned Earl Lovelace. Earl Lovelace is a writer who is known in Trinidad for not being one of those who emigrated to a big city overseas, to New York or to London, was continued to be based in the Caribbean writing his books. The same as I am. I found that inspirational. You talk about Nalo Hopkinson. When I picked up Nalo Hopkinson's Skinful, which is a collection of short stories based on folklore from the Caribbean, again, I was like, this writer is 20 years ahead of me and what I'm trying to do. I don't have to feel as if I'm breaking ground here. This is someone who has forged a way, cleared the path. Of course, I later discovered even earlier people, but for someone to be almost like mainstream doing it and not to be immediately identified as just Caribbean literature, but as also as SF, as very firmly embedded in the SF community. Nalo was definitely it. I also have to shout out Erna Broadber because Erna Broadber, when I encountered her on my first focus, I think it was, her reading just completely like blew my ears back, for the sheer amazing like imagination of it. And then as I began to research her approach, I was like, my goodness, this woman has a career trajectory that I kind of want. Also, an academic in sociology, who was using the data that she acquired from her nonfiction research to be portrayed in a fictional way to make it more accessible to a larger audience. I told you what I started with, which was the sciences, but I know as time went on, I ended up the PhD that was more in sociology of religion and doing sociological, socioeconomic research after that. So I found that a lot of what I was learning in my actual real life research is what then became the books. So that's why I mean when I say I don't want to call out anybody's fiction, because the reality is that no one's fiction per se has inspired me, but what people do with their fiction, how they translate their life and their learning into their fiction. I also was like, how do I distill my life and my learning and create something completely fresh and unique from that?
Mm.
Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy you know the homage, these my influences and so on, but it has been so much for me a journey of, I wanted to start with my own voice. I wanted to start with my own interests, my own tales, and sometimes that messes up marketing because marketing wants to know if you like this person, that person, that person, you will enjoy Carol. And I'm just like, yeah, you're gonna have fun trying to get that one worked out. but that's kind of how those people have inspired me in terms of, you know, what they're doing. And let me tell you, Caribbean SF, I will always champion it. I will always root for it. I will always celebrate it because I think we have such a rich tradition, not only in the literary, going way back into the oral. And it's always about, it's kind of almost parable telling. It's kind of like we're looking at the real world, but we're going to take the things that maybe are too hard to speak about, or the things that are so mundane that you don't see them anymore, and we're going to put a twist on them. We're going to give you a new filter, so you're going to see these things fresh, and you're going to ponder these things, and it's going to make a change in how you see them. That is completely like the foundation, the bedrock of Caribbean speculative fiction, our folklore, and our modern sci-fi. So I'm really just happy to be part of that.
Yeah, you're so generous. And I think that Caribbean SF, I mean, I know, not that I think, I know how much they love you. We were both at Bocas recently, and my
Oh, Bocas, yes, yes.
Everywhere I went, you know, writers on the ground were talking about you and how much you mean to them and how much you've done to nourish that space, the SF space in the Caribbean world, and the speculative space there, which is hugely inspiring, because what you're doing is you're opening up the space. You know, you're saying, yeah, this is a, you talked about learning and ways of learning, and how you admire writers that did that. And I think that's so interesting, because you're right, very often we think it's just about the work. It's not just about the work, it's about their practice, and it's about how they live, how they move in within their communities. And I think that you embody that so graciously and so beautifully. We would love we would love to hear an excerpt of your work, if you don't mind.
So I'm going to give you two excerpts. One is, in fact, from The Beautiful World. I apologize to those who might have heard it before. It's one of my favorite excerpts, especially during these very hot days that we're having. So this one is, remember that The Beautiful World is set 150 years or so in the future. And I would have to say that anyone who is writing about the future these days, climate change has to be embedded in the background, because we're in it now, and to not have that, you know, just a bit down the road seems a bit dishonest. So here we go. In Amsterdam, since the population collapse of the 2070s, it was possible to book not merely a suite of rooms, but a plot of land, complete with environmentally appropriate, low-impact dwellings and offices, security points included, and bordered by a grid of canals in a moat-like manner that was both aesthetically pleasing and slightly isolating. The walk between the cabins was short, but uncomfortable. The Netherlands was suffering from a summer heat spike, and everyone was either staying in during peak sun hours or huddling near the massive misting fans installed by civic administration along the banks of the canals. Tarek found the setup primitive, not because of its low level of technology, but because of the sense of too rapid change, evolution without consolidation. This city was no longer building on the foundations of an irretrievable past, but scrambling to keep ahead of the razor-sharp blade of a future that promised death to the unprepared. The climate had shifted. The design of older buildings was obsolete, and the city was trying to adapt with the ponderous speed of a battleship trying to change course. During his earlier travels, Tarek had seen a little of Amsterdam and a lot of the cities on other continents. Some places were more stable than others, but many of the once prosperous states of the Northern Hemisphere exuded desperation of various types and flavors. There was the desperation of a rich man in a mansion trying to enjoy the last of the party before the bill collectors broke down his door. There was the frantic virtue of a criminal turned monk, flagellating himself in vigorous but useless penance. Most of all, there was the manic optimism of incompetent politicians, assuring their public that the measures being employed were not at all too little and too late, and begging them not to erect the guillotines just yet. He knew his history, and this present had a familiar echo. Old empires were slowly falling. New orders were struggling to become established. Here, the new factor was the reach of it. This was not a single city to be sacked, burned, and left to crumble to ruin. Nor a mere country decimated and taken over by wildflowers and beasts amid the lingering threat of live minefields and unspent chemical shells. This was the whole basket overturned, all the eggs smashed, all the hopes crushed. Humankind had lived for 2 centuries with the ability to self-immolate utterly and a tendency to play with matches. It was only a matter of time before they followed through on that somber promise. No malice aforethought needed. Something, error, neglect, or the unpredictable and unprecedented might easily tip the balance against them. The entire planet was at a tipping point, ripe for salvation or destruction, angels of deliverance or barbarians. And in the meantime, bread and circuses made life bearable and occasionally diverting. That's from the Blue Beautiful World.
Thank you. That was such a treat. That was lovely. Yeah, so potent and yeah, again, like kind of mesmeric, not a word wasted at all. It's really interesting hearing you read the work because it just takes on another dimension. You know, when you read the book and then you hear it read out loud, it gives it even more layers hearing the author read it. It's such a beautiful thing. So thank you so much for that. Listening to you, I was wondering because a novel is such a huge undertaking, and I know you write short stories too. And I know that feeling. I love both mediums because people often ask, oh, you know, which do you prefer? Which is easier? They're both joyous, but for me, the danger zone in the novel is always the middle part because I have all the excitement at the beginning and I'm just like, oh my goodness, go go go. Then by the time I get to the middle, it's like, oh my goodness, how am I going to pull all these threads together? So I was wondering, with a work like this, the intricacies of this, you know, the themes within it, the balance of character, tone, trajectories, multitudes, were there difficulties that you encountered and how were you able to overcome them? Because I know there will be aspiring writers watching this who will
She's giving me a
need
craft question, people. Questions are dodgy questions because everyone has their own process.
This is it, but that's what's fascinating, I think, you know, to talk to writers and find out each person's process is different and unique to them. So yeah, I'm just curious as to how, if you did encounter those moments or those periods where, I don't know, you felt like maybe a little bit kind of, how do I get to the next point? Or, you know, what do I need to kind of inspire myself to push forward? How were you able to overcome those moments?
Okay. I hope that you're gonna find this story amusing and not dismaying, but let's go. So in order to tell you about the process for the Beautiful World, well, first I got to correct something. I'm really first and foremost a novelist who got occasionally dragged into doing short form fiction. It was like the one I got published, people were like, oh, we'd like for this anthology. I'm like, I haven't published any short fiction. You're like, just try it. And I was like, okay. So I tried, and then from there it's like, oh, well, we saw you publish this short story, we like it for this anthology, and then it kind of snowballs from there. But I agree with you, they each have different kinds of joy. And there's a way in which the short form, you have to like distill things and be more thematic, and you know, you have to be more economical sometimes with your characters because you don't have a lot of space for them to play. So I should point out then that, having said that, we're not just looking at the Blue Beautiful World as a novel, we're also looking at the Blue Beautiful World as part of a series. It is a self-contained novel, but it has some recurring characters from 2 previous books. The first book was Festival of Possible Worlds. No, when you talk about the middle of the book and how hard it was and so on, The Best of All Possible Worlds was ironically my easiest book. It's a book that I wrote that started off as writing exercises when I was struggling to write the sequel to Redemption and Indigo, which became Unraveling. But what you said just now about, the whole idea of craft and what have you, writers have to appreciate that they are going to evolve. They're going to get better at certain things. They're going to change their approach to certain things. So part of my challenge of Unraveling was that my ambitions were set a little bit too high initially, which is why it took me about 10 years to write. So because my ambitions were set too high, I would start something, I would hit a block, and then I would say, okay, let me try to write like a chapter or a short story to see if I can develop the skill. And at that point, that became The Best of All Possible Worlds. It just unfolded like that. And then I was like, I am now in this universe I've created very lovingly as a respite from the book I was actually struggling with. And now I want to continue to have that world unfold and it explore its galaxies. So then that became the Galaxy game. But again, sometimes your ambitions overleap the capacity that you're given. And as I was writing the Galaxy game, I was like, oh boy, I have more than a book's worth in here. I need to scale back on the plot I wanted to give the readers and just adjust things a bit. And that will be for a future book. So the future book was A Beautiful World. I did always intend to having created this galaxy, which had people who were refugees from Earth and refugees from other places and so forth, on one planet, and then other planets which were original planets or colonized planets. Having done all of that, I was like, well, Earth is part of this galaxy. It's under embargo because we're not there yet. But the return to Earth, the lifting of the embargo, the encounter, is always something I meant to write about. And it was kind of supposed to be in the Galaxy game, but then it was allowed its own story in the Beautiful World. And I had very clear ideas as how I was going to do it. I was going to do it contemporary to the present day, and I was going to be almost writing a semi-realist story. And it was 2016 when I first tried it, and first Brexit happened. And that really messed me up because I was going to start in the UK. I was like, okay, my whole vision of what the UK is going to be like around 2016, 2017 has just completely gone out the window. So I have to rethink this entire plot. And after Brexit, there was American politics, and the world just seemed to change so much. We hadn't even gone into the pandemic yet. But at that point, I just said, I need to push this farther into the future so I can just like think about it being realist. We're going to go far in the future where real life events can't mess up what I'm trying to plot. And anytime I'm writing a book, I start off with an idea of outline. But when I'm writing the book tells me what it's going to be. So when I get to that middle, as you say, I have to go back and revisit the whole outline. And then, well, I say middle, I actually stop at a third. I take it into thirds. And at each third, I'm revising the outline. And then when I finish the book, I'm revising the whole manuscript. Because now the book has told me what it's supposed to be. And I realize I may need to change focus here or seed some foreshadowing there. And it's still a very joyous, I love that word you gave me, experience to me because I'm in communication with this piece of art. It's talking to me, it's telling me things, the characters are in my head. So I almost don't want to be too in control because the things that they're giving me sometimes are better than what I came into the project expecting to portray or to show the reader.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think that's just exactly what people need to hear, is that you're listening to the book. The book is telling you, like you said, what it wants to do. But you also have that agency, like you said, to go back to your intentions for it. So it's this kind of lovely mix of your idea and then this book becoming its own sort of animal, really. And you have to kind of pay, which is great. It's a living, breathing, potent thing. And you have to pay attention to it. Well, this living, breathing, wonderful thing has been longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, one of the biggest prizes in the world. I want to draw attention to this because it is a big deal. This is so fantastic, I think, for a large audience to be introduced to a writer like you. Some of them may have been familiar with you already, but the prize really does introduce women's voices to a whole new legions of readers and
I'm
fans.
so grateful for that. Yes.
Right, right. How do you feel about that? Because it's a brilliant thing.
I was completely startled because the reality is that um, speculative fiction is often not taken seriously by prizes that are considered to be more literary. Let's just be honest about that.
Yeah.
So there are certain prizes that I kind of expect I might have a chance at, and then there are others I just don't even look at at all. So when I published it, that way I was like, what? Where? I was complete. But then I felt kind of grateful because the reality is that Caribbean SF has always leaned literary. It has always had more to say, had layers, had nuance, and so forth. Not always identifiable by the Western reader, by the way, because sometimes you would need our historical and cultural context to see what we're trying to do. But it's always been present. And I'm always incredibly grateful when someone sees sufficient in my book to say, yes, you know what, this is award worthy, this is notice worthy, this is nomination worthy. I'm always grateful for that.
Yeah, and it's so well deserved. I mean, let's not beat about the bush. It absolutely deserves its place as far as I'm concerned, which is just wonderful. I want to ask you about, you touched on the speculative space and the Caribbean speculative space, but how do you think the speculative and the sci-fi space expands the Black imagination? I've heard you talk about the speculative genre as sociological fiction, as being interested in near futures. So could you expand a little bit more about all of those things?
So sorry. When I start off slow, it's because I have a lot of thoughts and I'm like, I can't ramble on for too long, so let's try to distill this. You mentioned the word sociological fiction, and I'm going to use that as a jumping off point. So first, I got to give credit to Dr. Brian an anthropologist, no, ethnographer, sorry, anthropologist, I believe, at Goldsmiths, who was interviewing me and introduced me to this concept. C. Wright Mills wrote a book back in 1960 called The Sociological Imagination and said how important the sociological imagination was for researchers, and that good novelists already possess this imagination, which I thought was like, it's nice to be already recognized in your field there. And the idea of the sociological imagination is that you are going to look at not just the individual, like going through this, trajectory of life or story of thought or whatever, but you're looking at the individual's personal concerns, personal issues, also in the context of public issues. So the individual embedded in their community is a very important thing. And also the historical context that caused the community to be the way it is now is also an important aspect. I think very much we in the Caribbean who've lived through a lot of history understand that. And we also understand that there's a sort of a slightly bad word used in craft called agency. A character must have agency. And if your character doesn't have agency, you're doing something wrong. And Caribbean writers and writers from around the globe have been pushing back against that a bit because agency assumes privilege. It really does. It really does suggest that you are already in an environment that allows you to make certain choices, that allows you to follow through and reach certain rewards, or at least even have the expectation of reaching those rewards. So sometimes the mere negotiation between what you want as an individual and what your community allows or expects from you, what your obligations are to your family, to your workplace, to your team members in your workplace and whatever, all of these really are what form our trajectory in reality. And I think it's more interesting to have that in a book. I do feel like Caribbean literature gets that quite a bit more, where the kind of the character choices, the way the characters' trajectories unfold, it's always with the recognition that you don't go through your life, your book of life, as a superhero with sidekicks and people like supporting and facilitating you, where everything that happens is happening to further your path. you are always in negotiation with people who are the heroes of their own story. You're in negotiation with, the traumas of past history, the desires of your ancestors that were stymied. All of that forms part of how you live, who you are, and how your story unfolds. That kind of complexity, I believe, is what Caribbean SF, Caribbean literature brings to the novel.
Thank you so much for that. That was beautifully articulated and so rich and nuanced. I'm glad that this has been recorded so I can go back and take notes, basically. I find you a compassionate, profound writer and thinker. You've referred to land as ancestry in conversation, the act of living on lands as creating bonds and blessings, which I find so beautiful and inspiring, that if we listen to the call of the land more, actually would have a better relationship with it, because we don't listen to it enough. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your thinking behind that, because it's so good to be reminded of that, because we've lost that. I feel like we've lost that connection somewhat, which is such a shame. But when I heard you touch on that, I thought that blew my mind in the way that you talked about land as ancestry. I was like, wow, this is so interesting. So yeah, I would love for you to just talk a little bit about that.
So I'm going to give a little context for what you're just referring to, because this came out of the Boldness festival that we attended and a panel that we were at. So I am being asked to elaborate on a response I gave very off the cuff at the moment to a question, which was a question that moved me, but was also a question I hadn't thought about on certain levels. So I was answering and exploring also within myself what it meant. The question really was, who walks with us, as we go. And of course, the immediate answer seems to be your ancestors. And I was thinking about that. And then as I thought about it, I was like, who are my ancestors? And yes, my ancestors are the parents and grandparents and great grands and those going back, that even the archives can't trace. Yes, ancestry is blood, but ancestry is also community. Ancestry is also the environment you're in, physical environment you're in. There's something about being able to come home, and something about the smell of the salt spray in the air and just the degree of humidity and the tingle of the sun on your skin, all of that communicating with you in a way that feels very personal, that feels very much like, that there's a communication going on there. And that was why my response, response of, what, I feel it's more than people. I feel it's the connection of people in the land somehow becomes a part of your spirit. I did mention that it's not just my home country that gives me that feeling. There are other places I've visited where I feel this profound connection, and I do wonder to myself, it's all bias, but still, I do wonder to myself that feeling of blessedness. That's the time Herbie used the term blessed. You're in a place and it feels welcoming to you. It feels nurturing. It feels like, I've had humanity on my soil, and humanity has treated me well, and I'm curious and interested in this new person on my soil, and I'm ready to show you the best of me. I love it when I travel to a place that immediately gives me that kind of message. So I'm still working that through. I don't have any academic books or studies or anything to back up that feeling. That's very much just a novice feeling, an artist feeling, and maybe I'll write a story about it someday and work through it some more.
Yeah, I can't wait to read that story. So when you do write it, let me know, because I love the idea of it so much. Writing a novel is about deeply engaging with truth and painful things sometimes, in ways that make us, shift our inner and intellectual states. If it's doing its job, I think a great novel does that. Not all novels do that, but great books do. And I feel like this book is a book that does that. How have you, in this process, transformed as a writer yourself whilst working on this book? Because a book takes several years. A book takes time and takes commitment. and it changes while you're writing it, and you grow, you evolve. Well, we hope, that
Mm.
that happens. So I'm curious because you're so astute, I think, and so aware, as a voice and as a writer, that I'm curious as to how you feel, that process has impacted you.
Mm. Now that's an absolutely fascinating question, because I do feel that there are two ways in which the writing of a book or even the reading of a book can change you. First, it can change you on the level of being a creator of stories. You learn certain skills, you break through certain blocks, and you're like, okay, I actually have confidence that I can do X or Y that I may not have before. But then, as I said, because the book has been in communication with you and telling you things you never expected, you do change as a person. But the publishing process takes time. So the time between, my manuscript is done and the book is on the shelf, there's a whole nother change you go through. Let's not even talk about edits and whatever. And so, but for me, when I look at this book, there's the fact that my ideas for it came from when I was writing the Galaxy game. So we're talking like 2012, 2013, thereabouts, even earlier. Then there's the fact that when I really started to try to write it, that was more 2016, and the world was changing rapidly. And the world changing rapidly means that you yourself have to, adjust your thinking. The actual drafting of it took place in the early months of the pandemic. So I think by end of April, end of May, or thereabouts, was when I finished the draft. But then the pandemic also slowed down the publishing industry even more. So there are ways in which I had time to sit with the finalized manuscript for longer than usual. And then when it was published, that gap was so long. I've said to people before that sometimes I feel as if I need a distance of at least 3 years between me and a book to know if I've actually done anything at it. And in a way, I had that 3 years before this even got on the shelf. And to look back and see what you've written in enough time that you've almost forgotten what it felt like to write it, where you're looking literally back at past you and thinking about what kind of person they were. It's also extremely educational.
Yeah.
And I really do have to say that if you are a person who wants stability in your writing, you want to be able to produce the same book each time, then I'm not quite sure how you do it, because for me, the excitement, the learning is in the fact that I'm evolving even as my craft is evolving, even as product of my craft is evolving. And I say I might use words like improve, but the reality is improving suggests you're going higher and higher and higher on some kind of scale that who knows what it is. Let's just say I want to expand, I want to deepen, I want to acquire like levels and nuance and whatever. I want to go into areas that I didn't even know existed, and map those areas, come back on and go, wow, that was amazing, and then for another new path. And I'm really grateful that this career has given me that so far. And as I said, not just in the fact that you're writing fiction, but even in the fact that you are researching nonfiction to bring the vividness of the fiction. So you're constantly learning, you're constantly discovering new things.
Yeah, I love that you said learning and discovering and expansion and deepen. These are all things that I think a writer, an artist should be aiming for, really. Like you said, you don't want to produce the exact same book, because what's the fun in that? You've already done that.
The marketers are going to be upset with me.
They can be upset,
again,
but
it's going to be like, if you enjoy the best of all possible worlds, you will find Galaxy game a bit different. I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to give you something that you can reliably come back to and say, oh, I know what a Karen Lord book is like. No, you don't.
Yeah, no, you're keeping them, you're changing it, and you're keeping them on their toes as well, which is a great thing. Karen, I could talk to you for hours. It's been so wonderful and enriching to have this conversation. Thank you for being so generous with your
Thank you.
time and
And
your
your
knowledge.
questions have just been amazing. You've pulled a lot out of me that most people don't. Thank you so much
Oh,
for the brilliance of the questions, honestly.
no, it's such a joy. I've been so looking forward to this conversation, and honestly, it has set me up for this week. I tell you,
Yes.
bank holiday in the UK, and then a treat interviewing the amazing Karen Lord. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful to have you join us. And thank you to our online Fane audience for joining us too. If you haven't picked it up, The Blue Beautiful World by Karen Lord, it's a tremendous achievement. I can't recommend it enough.